Good evening, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the City of St. John's Ward 2 by-election candidates town hall, brought to you by Happy City St. John's. Happy City's vision is a happy and engaged St. John's fostered through inclusive community conversations and consultations. Happy City is hosting its virtual annual general meeting on Wednesday, October 21st at 7 p.m. if you'd like to attend. Please visit happycity.ca to register. We want to thank the Ward 2 candidates who've joined us this evening. With us are Carol Furlong, Matt House, Lauren Loader, Gregory Noseworthy, Ophelia Ravencroft, Sean Skinner, and Greg Smith. Wallace Ryan is hoping and planning to join us later in this town hall. Before we begin, for our candidates and for those watching, our format is as follows. We have 5 questions for the candidates provided us by the residents of Ward 2. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer each question. We kindly ask candidates to respond to the question, addressing their own platform and not speaking to the platforms of other candidates or responding to other candidates. Our order for response to questions has been decided randomly to ensure fairness to all candidates. We have a timekeeper who will alert each candidate as their time runs down. Before we begin, I'd like to remind each candidate to remain muted unless it is their turn to speak. We invite all candidates and those watching on Facebook to share our stream so others can engage with the issues alongside of us. Let's get started. Our first question is, if you could only work on one thing during your time on council, what would it be? How would you do it? And how would you pay for it? Please be as specific as possible in all details. And I invite Sean Skinner to speak first.
Thank you very much, Brad, and good evening, everybody, and good evening to my fellow candidates. The one thing that I would work on if I were to be elected in this by-election would be the whole issue of accessibility in our city. And accessibility to me includes walkability, it includes public transit, it includes people being able to get out and get to medical appointments, socialize, to work, etc. Now, how would I do that? Well, I'll speak to my most recent experience on Metrobus. I was a commissioner at Metrobus until I declared that I was running for this seat and I had to resign. And I'd like to think that we did a lot of good work as a team at Metrobus. We tried to get a university pass in so university students could have access to public transit. We went to the provincial government to see if we were able to convince them to work with us to have people who are low income be able to access bus passes to help them with their needs. And we were successful in that. And the province, to their credit, stepped up and put some money forward to assist with that. And we provided as Metrobus, as a city, a discounted rate so that that could happen for people. We also talk about snow clearing. That's been a topic over the last number of weeks. There's been talks about the survey that was done by the city in the past while. And, I was one of the people who responded to that survey and participated in that public engagement. And I would like to see our sidewalks cleared. There are a lot of people, in particular in Ward 2, who walk or use public transit and do not have access to a vehicle or do not want to have access to a vehicle. And they should be just as supported as the people who drive vehicles and who we spend a lot of time and money clearing roads for. There's no reason why the people who do not want or do not have access to a vehicle aren't able to get around just as easily as the people who are in vehicles. So from my perspective, what I would say is that accessibility would be a number one thing that I would try and work on. And I think accessibility basically would lead people to economic opportunities, physical well-being, mental well-being, social activities, and a number of things like that. So that's my response, Mr. Glynn. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Carol, if you could only work on one thing during your time on council, what would it be? How would you do it? And how would you pay for it? Being as specific as possible.
Okay, I'll try that again. Thank you, and good evening to your viewers and to candidates. Thank you for inviting me to this forum. If I could work on one thing, it would have to be something that's coming up very soon, and that would be the upcoming budget, and that would be maintaining the current level of taxes. And I think we could do this very easily by finding efficiencies in our operating costs. Um, for example, we could, eliminate that subsidy at Mile 1 and our convention center. The costs associated with those, they're not revenue generating propositions for the city, and I think we need to negotiate the terms of a transaction for dealing with that. I think we could also look at some of the capital works projects and determine what can be delayed for a year or two that are not going to have any significant impact on the people. And in light of the current economy. So in this economic climate, we do have to find solutions that are going to work for the people, but are not going to interfere with the needs of what the people of the city require. And while I can appreciate, I will say this, while I can appreciate the nature of the question, where you talk about if we could do one thing, let me just simply say to you that I can't even imagine taking office and dealing with one issue. Ward 2 is a very large, a dynamic and diverse part of the city. And it's a mixture, of the old city with the new. You have suburbia with the old city, historic properties, you have family housing, you have all kinds of different issues. It's pretty much a melting pot within this city. It requires somebody who has the ability to juggle a myriad of issues and concerns. And as an effective counselor for Ward 2, that has to be someone who can multitask. I'm experienced in multitasking, and I have taken on many issues, big and small. And having talked to many of the constituents in this ward, I can tell you that I'm ready to start off with dealing with many of the issues that they've already raised with me while I've been talking to them. So thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Matt, if you could only work on one thing during your time on council, what would it be? How would you do it? And how would you pay for it, being as specific as possible?
All right. I think if I were to work on just one thing, it would have to be investing in planning, equipment, and personnel, so we can get to the point where we can have our sidewalks cleared and safe within 24 hours of a snowfall. In the last few years, it's been pretty common for some sidewalks to go 3 and 4 days without being cleared, and that's very problematic because it forces people to either one, walk in unsafe conditions, or 2, stay inside for a long period of time. Neither of those are very good things to be at. It also compounds the issue of snow clearing in general, because as people walk on the sidewalks and they pack down the snow and ice forms, when the city equipment and staff do show up, it's much harder to clear those sidewalks. So how would I do that? I think a very important first step would be implementing the recently proposed and struck down a $1.35 million increase to the city snow clearing budget. How we could pay for that would be, I think one easy fix would be to eliminate the commercial vacancy allowance that gives landlords a 50% tax break on their business tax. In 2018 and 2019, that amounted to about $4.3 million each year in potential or lost potential revenue for the city. Now, some people would say that we have to be careful because we're in tough economic times, and maybe this tax break can help small businesses. But the reality is the majority of commercial space in this city is owned by wealthy property management companies and holding companies and things like that. And this tax break generally amounts to be a tax break for the richest of the rich amongst us.
Thank you, Matt. Lauren, if you could only work on one thing during your time on council, what would it be? How would you do it? And how would you pay for it, being as specific as possible?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and hello, everybody, and very best wishes. Excuse me. If I could work on one thing while on council, it'd be the downtown pedestrian mall. As someone who spent 25 years in business on Water Street, I've been entrenched in the downtown core, and I've experienced many different shifts in the economy down there in that time. I feel this is the concept that's been the biggest shift in my time there. It was an absolute game changer. It was new and exciting. It drew people that were new to downtown down there. Downtown has been challenged a lot in recent years. There's been oil and gas companies that have moved out. There's the growth of power centers, of course, online shopping, these types of things. So there's been a lot of things impacting that area. This is a time to be innovative and avail every opportunity we can to revitalize the downtown core. The downtown is an asset to the entire city. It's the center of culture, commerce, finance, many things. It all started as an emergency effort, of course, but people really gravitated towards it. It was an organic thing that just kind of took on a life of its own. I've spoken to many people in the downtown area, retailers, bar and restaurant owners, people working in corporate environments, banking, et cetera, et cetera. And the reaction has been overwhelmingly positive. I also understand that the concept is not perfect, and there was a downside. And I've been speaking to Duckworth Street, for example. I was speaking to many business owners on Duckworth Street, and I think we need to carry on with those conversations and sit down at the table and everybody bring their ideas forward. And I think with proper communication, we can figure out solutions to make the entire downtown a vibrant and successful area. As for the costs, the beautiful thing about this project is the businesses themselves will feed a lot of it. The businesses will be responsible for the infrastructure. Furthermore, I've noticed a huge increase in the interest in vacancies down there. There's a lot of people asking questions about vacancies. So those tax dollars, once those properties are occupied, those monies will contribute to the project as well, of course. So it's just one organic model that kind of feeds itself. It brings people, brings businesses, and gets people away from other areas in the city, like, the power centers. It brings people back to the downtown core, which, of course, as I said, is an asset to the entire city as a whole.
Thank you, Lauren. Greg Smith, if you could only work on one thing during your time on council, what would it be? How would you do it? And how would you pay for it? Being as specific as possible.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having all of us. Happy City. Hello to the fellow candidates, and hello to everybody watching online. One of the biggest and most important things, and it's near and dear to me, is accessibility on the side of laneways being clear and sidewalk snow clearing. I think we need to make sure that they're accessible all year round. Our roadways are vital for transportation and for safety. So should our sidewalks and our laneways. As someone who rides the bus, I walk to services, I walk to work sometimes if the weather's good. Having ice-covered and snow-covered sidewalks is dangerous for everybody in this city, and we really need to do a better job on that. The way that I would pay for that, first of all, I would look to mimic the $1.3 million that was suggested by council this year. I would do that without raising taxes. I don't think that it is attractive or it is a good idea to raise taxes during a pandemic when people are already struggling. I think that what we can do, though, however, is the sale of Mile 1, which I think is a really good idea. Sell that for somewhere between 15 to 20 million or so. And then we could have multiple year plan for that 1.3 million, and also eliminate the St. John Sports and Entertainment subsidy. That was 3.4 million, like I said, last year. I think there's other ways that we can find ways to lower costs on this as well. And talking with people and, looking at stuff myself, there's other jurisdictions across our nation that actually have homeowners and business owners clear the sidewalks that are adjacent to their property. So I think there's ways that we can get this done, make St. John's safe for everybody, and not raise taxes. And that would be one of the biggest things for me to go forth into City Hall.
Thank you, Greg. Ophelia, if you could only work on one thing during your time on council, what would it be? How would you do it? And how would you pay for it? Being as specific as possible.
Good evening, folks. Let me mess around with the windows a little here. Happy City for having us and to everybody else for coming. Am I audible, Brad?
You are. We got you. Thank you.
So to echo the points that a number of my colleagues have been making here tonight, I'm a pedestrian primarily. I've never owned a car in my life. I've been a long-term pedestrian in St. John's. I've been living here for 13 years, and I know firsthand how rough the conditions of sidewalks get here in the winter. If I had to focus on one thing, it's been the issue I've been yelling about here at the age of 15, which is improving sidewalk snow clearing. To get to this as comprehensively as I can, I think we need to be looking at our working methods as effectively as possible to make sure that we're using the most up-to-date we can, be that devices like icebreakers or snow melters that could potentially radically transform the way that we do business with sidewalks, and also changing the timing of procedures to ensure that sidewalks are cleared earlier and then either not filled in by snowplows, especially in the downtown where we have no boulevards for the piling of snow, or that if that is inevitable, that they be cleared again by the city as quickly as possible. In Halifax, where I grew up, we do have a residential clearing requirement. Worked quite well, and which I had no particular problem with when I was growing up. I think it's worth investigating. I'm not going to say I'm going to implement it because I understand that, for some people that could be quite difficult, but I think it's worth investigating. So it's a matter of evidence-based policy because I think that's extremely important instead of mere conjecture. I think in terms of how we're going to fund this, a number of points my platform addressed. I'm looking to end a lot of handouts, and I'm looking to end a lot of favors that I think we do for the wealthy. In particular, I think we're looking at issues like progressively reducing the vacancy allowance in each year that it's claimed. We're looking at tying the size of the SJSC operational grant to observed economic and cultural benefits so that at the very least we can make sure that we're saving as much as we can there. I don't prefer to, some of us have said, but I'm going to keep in mind that in the recent public engagement process on snow clearing, quite a lot of residents did say they would be okay with a small increase on taxes. While it's not something that I'm necessarily looking to propose, should tax increases come down the pipe at some point in the near future, as some people are certainly beginning to say they are, I will make sure on council that the money goes to getting our sidewalks clear. Having to walk on the snow and ice, and I will make it, and I will fix this for all of us.
Thank you, Ophelia. And Greg Noseworthy, if you could work on one thing during your time on council, what would it be? How would you do it? And how would you pay for it? Being as specific as possible.
Well, firstly, again, as everybody has done, thank you, Brad. Thank you, Carrie. Thank everybody at Happy St. John's for putting this together. I know a lot of work goes into this, and really appreciate that. The reality is that this is a 10-month position. We're going to the polls again next September. To come out guns blazing saying I'm going to do these grandiose things, it's not going to be possible. It's a 10-month term. There's only going to be an opportunity to do certain small things and to work for a better, brighter future. The one thing that I would do that is cost neutral, meaning that it will not cost the city any more at all, it won't cost a dime, is to introduce a seniors ride free day. And many municipalities across the country do this. Ottawa does it, a whole bunch of other capital cities do it. The idea being that we allow senior citizens, the ones who have the highest accessibility need by per capita, per population basis, we give them an opportunity to go to medical appointments, to go grocery shopping, to go visit friends, family, do whatever they need to do. And there's no cost to it. It's eaten up by the fact that the bus has an overhead, and that's it. There is no cost. We might lose a couple dollars here and there for certain senior citizens who would ride the bus, but $2 for one person to save a few pennies here and there, it's not that great. We're fortunate that the provincial government recently introduced an income pass for a number of people. However, the reality is that doesn't capture everybody, and there's still a number of persons who are not able to get accessible, affordable, safe transit throughout the city. It'd be a great thing to be able to go out and spend a bunch of money and do all these kinds of things, but the reality is we have a financial crunch coming right now. COVID-19 has wrecked the budgets of the city. The city has a number of contracts with different organizations, with a number of sporting organizations as well that it needs to uphold. To turn our backs on those and sell Model 1, we're going to eat some costs there. There's going to be some penalties for that, there's no doubt. So we need to be aware of that and make sure that any decisions we do are cost neutral while not increasing the taxes on the citizens of St. John's. Thank you.
Thank you all for your responses to our first question. A reminder that our order of response is random, and we'll move on to our second question, trying to keep within 2 minutes as best as possible, which we did a great job of that time. Thank you, candidates. So our second question for you all: what are your top 3 infrastructure priorities for Ward 2 and why? And Greg Noseworthy, we're going to lead off with you, so you can go ahead again.
I knew you were framing it, getting ready to say that with the random part there, so that's okay. I don't mind it at all. 3 things for me, and some of the questions coming up address some of the other big issues that are impacting the ward. So I'm going to keep it away from the snow clearing here tonight on this particular question. It's certainly a huge infrastructure priority of mine, but I would definitely have to say housing being one of them. I think we've noticed with a number of people out this year at the pedestrian mall, we see really how rampant homelessness is within the city of St. John's. And it's not a good thing. It's 2020. We need to be doing better to allow people to actually have a roof over their head, and not just a roof over their head, but an affordable place to heat. Seniors, again, one of those issues. You see people at the Village, at the Avalon Mall, trying to stay warm in the winter months because they can't afford heating. This is ridiculous in a developed country, capital city in a province in Canada. We need to work on better housing infrastructure. Transit, again, I won't belabor this point, but in terms of accessibility, we need to make sure that everybody in our city can get around, regardless of socio or economic status. It's a huge thing to have people to get around such a massive city, and really it is a massive city. And the reality here is a lot of these questions are going to gear towards Ward 2 tonight, but as a councillor for Ward 2, I'm going to be doing work for the entire city. It's not just limited to Ward 2. We need to be aware of the entire city and how it impacts everybody. Additionally, I think green space is a huge priority. We're seeing now the decisions of the 1990s when council had an opportunity to preserve green spaces and to make the city more accessible. They chose not to do it. We're seeing the problems out in Galway now. It's a new development. It's got a number of issues. The roundabouts, it's happening again. And if we don't have a forward thinking view to these things, we're going to repeat the same mistakes and be having this exact same conversation in 2050. So for me, it's housing, transit, and green space to a brighter and better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Ophelia, what are your top 3 infrastructure priorities for Ward 2 and why?
So, I'll echo some points that Greg has said here, but, I think that the key for me for developing infrastructure, we have to have a fairly clear kind of focus on the kind of work that we're trying to do. As I see it, the direction that we want our city to be going in, and that we want our ward to be going in, we need to be focusing our help, and I'll be saying this throughout the night, on people, government's assistance. That's our most vulnerable citizens, and that means focusing on issues like, and this is what I'll try and hammer home here, it means anything that improves accessibility, anything that improves mobility, especially without cars, and affordable housing. Affordable housing, we've just announced a development that's been approved up today as in an intensification area on the Marchant Road to replace dairies, which is great. I think projects of that nature, especially ones that don't eat up green space, if we can find ways to work with the private sector to prioritize making those units available as affordable units, I think that can be extremely beneficial for our city. I'd certainly like to be pushing for as much of that as I can. Mobility and accessibility are near and dear to my heart. I've spoken about sidewalks, but I also think that it's important in infrastructural improvements to assist people with disabilities. 3 that I've proposed in listening to the concerns of the community and those people with disabilities that I've spoken to are increasing the numbers of audible crosswalk signals, yellow nosing on city stairways, and blue zone parking in the downtown. Those are 3 simple, fairly low-cost solutions that should have been implemented, in my opinion, ago. And I don't really know why we haven't done them yet, but it will be my pleasure to make sure they get done now. And in terms of mobility and transit, I think we need to be refocusing our infrastructure improvements and investments away from anything really to do with car culture. I think that means better investment in public transit. And I think in particular, it means continuing to implement the Bike St. John's master plan, including the introduction trails, which also have tremendous benefit to people with disabilities, and which might be much easier to clear in the winter, which is great for pedestrians too. I think if we focus on those things, we'll have a much more equitable city, and ultimately that's what I'm trying to accomplish.
Thank you, Ophelia. Sean, what are your top 3 infrastructure priorities for Ward 2 and why?
Thank you very much, Brad, for the question. In talking to the residents of Ward 2 during this campaign, the kinds of issues that I've had presented to me, the things that people have talked to me about have been wide and varied. But based on the question that you've got, I do have three that I want to speak to. The first one is a downtown library. I grew up in downtown St. John's. We had a downtown library when I grew up in downtown St. John's, and it was a focal point for all of us to go and socialize, to read, to learn. I at a very early age, had a library card and got used to going to the library to get information that I needed. It was very much a good equalizer. Back in my day, there was no internet and those kinds of things when I grew up there, but certainly today libraries would have that, and I think that would be a great equalizer for people as well. So I'd love to see the reinstatement of a downtown library from an infrastructure perspective as my point number one. I think it would be an attraction to people. I think it would bring people into the ward. And as I said earlier, I think it will be a great equalizer as well for a lot of people. The second thing that I want to speak to is the whole area of built heritage. Now, by built heritage, I mean some of the wonderful examples we have of architecture in our city. And I'll speak to one just very briefly that I was personally involved with as a member of a particular society here in St. John's, and that was the Benevolent Irish Society building on Queen's Road. We sold that building as a society probably 20 years ago because we couldn't afford the upkeep on it. It used to be a school, as some people would remember. It was bought by a group of architects called Nolan Hall, and they repurposed that building into condos and townhouses, and basically kept the facade and kept the exterior of the building as it was. And I think it was a great example of repurposement of the building. That's also been done with Bannerman Brewery. And the third thing I want to mention, some other people have mentioned this as an infrastructure priority for me, would be I've spent the last number of years working on the Committee of End Homelessness St. John's. So safe, affordable, and accessible housing for people in our community is very important. If you're going to have a good, vibrant city, people have to be able to afford to live there. So I think that's the third priority. So I want to talk about a downtown library, our built heritage, and third, and not necessarily the third in terms of my priority, would be the whole idea of housing as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Lauren, what are your top three infrastructure priorities for Ward 2 and why?
Pardon me, I forgot to unmute. I think the top infrastructure issue in St. John's is the new, well, the much needed water treatment facility. Granted, that's more of a greater for the entire city. For Ward 2 specifically, the Water Street dig is a very important one. The infrastructure down there is very antiquated. I can tell you from experience walking up and down Water Street that you can smell sewage from the storm sewers, and that's just wrong. That's been the case for decades. So that project is going to carry on. That's been ongoing for years, and it's going to carry on. But what's most important about that project is the communication and between the city, residents, and businesses. That's the key piece there, so that everything can remain functioning and everything just doesn't come to a standstill for several months. Secondly, Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi downtown. We've recently seen free Wi-Fi in Bannerman Park and Victoria Park. There's free Wi-Fi zones in many places all over the world. It's becoming very standard, very much the norm. The costs, as technology grows, the costs are going down. And of course, there's always room for corporate sponsorship there as well. That's something that I would pursue there. And thirdly, and I think traffic calming. I wasn't a fan of certain traffic calming measures originally. I thought they might interfere with snow clearing measures. But in the last year, I've really changed my mind on them. On Queen's Road, for example, it's a great example. There's very bulbous curbs. It creates larger sidewalks, a place for people to gather, potentially have a tree planted, but it really it brings the traffic to a much slower pace, and I think it's been very effective.
Thank you, Lauren. Matt, what are your top 3 infrastructure priorities for Ward 2 and why?
Well, number one would be the development and implementation of cycling paths, and that's a 3-pronged issue of public health, accessibility, and transportation. So, we need to get on the go with implementing the Bike St. John's master plan with that. Second of all, I'd have to say replacing the 100-plus-year-old water and sewer lines we have across large portions of Ward 2. We just saw a big flood on Kings Road there a few days ago. That was from an aging sewer line. We saw a similar thing happen on Prescott Street 1 or 2 years ago when a similar thing happened. The road itself lifted up from the water and it washed away underneath. And these are serious problems, and we're going to keep on having them, especially because, we're living in a time of a changing climate. We're going to have more storms like Igor. We're going to have more storms like Snowmageddon. We have to be ready for this. And also, we've got more urban sprawl, and we've got development happening above the 190-meter contour line, which means a lot more pressure on the water that's running off and a lot more volume that's going through these aging water lines. And third, I think it's very important that we do not privatize our public infrastructure, particularly Mile 1. That was built with $20.5 million of public money about 20 years ago. Adjusted for inflation, that's $30.6 million today. There's no way the public is going to get a decent return on their investment if that gets sold. They're going to lose a large portion of the public wealth that's been built up in this city over the last 20 years. Not to mention the fact that big events like the Briar and the Scotties and whatnot, they don't deal with private businesses and corporations and property managers. They deal only with municipalities. So if we privatize something like Mile 1, we're not going to get those big marquee events anymore, and that's a big hit to the local economy and small business in the downtown. How am I doing for time there?
You're over about 15 seconds.
Okay, well, we'll stop it there then.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks for checking too. All right, Greg Smith, what are your top 3 infrastructure priorities for Ward 2 and why?
So I think redesigning the downtown to make it more, well, the whole Ward 2 and the city itself, but the downtown to be more pedestrianly friendly is a great thing for people's health and also for small business as well. So is that looking at expanding the Water Street pedestrian mall into Duckworth? I think, that should be something that we look at. Making it open as long as economically viable for all businesses. And I think that, there was a ton of benefits to that as a city. And even, from making it a more fluid design, if the weather is poor and no one's going to be down there, at least allow for maybe one-way traffic. So then we could have people pick up from certain stores, chat with business owners, and they said when the weather was poor, their business was much worse. So I think we need to find ways to combat that and work with all the businesses downtown and make this city and Ward more pedestrian friendly, whether it's traffic calming ways, a bit of everything. Chatting with people, especially in Kitty Vitty, in Signal Hill, and the Battery. And this was a huge issue. This place is seen, around the world in postcards. It is seen, on National Geographic, a bit of everything. And it's viewed by millions.
I've lost Greg. Carrie, have you as well?
Worldwide. And one of the issues that I think. Hello?
You're back, Greg. You're back. Go ahead.
Okay. Can I reclaim the 10 seconds of loss?
Absolutely. You were speaking about the fact Signal Hill and Kitty Vitty show up on postcards, and that's where we lost you. Go right ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. So these areas, Kitty Vitty, the Battery, Signal Hill, they're seen, on postcards, National Geographic, by millions of people worldwide. And an issue that a lot of people were facing down there and talking about was that the fact that new development there didn't fit the mold and the heritage fittings for that. So I think that design standards are a must, And I think that we need to have new development there, make sure it looks like the area that it's in, because this is a place that is notorious for its heritage and for its colorful houses and for a certain type of houses. Another thing too is making the city more accessible for everybody in the sense of audible crosswalks, visibility lines, and making sure that this is a city for everybody. So I want to make sure, those are kind of some of my big three. There's a couple more, but a city for everybody, design standards, and making sure that we are more pedestrian minded, which benefits small business. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. And Carol, what are your top 3 infrastructure priorities for Ward 2 and why?
Okay, so as some of the others have alluded to, we do have some long-term ongoing major projects, and those are the ones that most people don't give a lot of thought to because many of them are underground, with our pipes and things like that. So those are major issues of concern that have to be addressed in an old city. Those are things that have to be dealt with. So that's a priority issue, obviously. Second of all, I would like to see affordable housing addressed, especially for seniors. And what a better place than in this ward, because it's so dynamic and exciting a ward that we see places for seniors built where there's no access to very much. And I think to have some of these in a downtown type setting or close to downtown where someone can hop on a bus and enjoy all of that would be very, something ideal. The third thing I want to talk about with respect to infrastructure is not necessarily a type of development, but is how we develop our city. And we've seen in the past, and most recently we've seen this past year, petitions with up to nearly 5,000 signatures for people who are pretty unhappy with what had transpired in the course of development. And I think we need to set out a plan that will be consistent and doesn't change from developer to developer, from project to project, so that we can address those issues of concern to people, such as, climate, environmental, historic concerns that fit in with our city structure. I grew up in the East End. I could come out of our house, turn to my left and look up and see the Cabot Tower. Turn to my right and look down at the harbor. Now, when you come out of that house, when I go to visit, it's always so sad. All you see is brown brick. You can't see any of the historic sites at all. And people didn't realize that was happening really at the time. And we've seen it now again, where somebody wants to deal with some kind of development, and all of a sudden we need to put an extra floor on something. And that's going to take away people's view. So it's very important, I think, that we develop that kind of plan so that people are not taken off guard, so the developers know in advance what the rules of the games are. And I think that's pretty important as well.
Thank you, Carol. So that finishes our second question for our Happy City St. John's Ward 2 by-election town hall. For those watching on Facebook Live, I encourage you to share it so others can engage. As we move into our third question, just a reminder to the candidates, our timeline is 2 minutes per question. And we ask that as we get into this, there's probably going to be more of an urge to respond to positions held by your other candidates, but please stick to your own platform and speaking to your ideas. On to our third question. Between Snowmageddon, COVID-19, and federally required water treatment improvements, St. John's will be looking at a budget crunch during your term. How would you approach the process of budgeting in the city? And our first response will be from Ophelia. Thank you.
Okay, get myself set up here. I want to talk for a minute here about the kind of vision that I have for the finances of the city. And it's in drawing on, my research and my experiences with states or cities or provinces elsewhere that I admire. As far as I'm concerned, when we talk about budgeting, We need to have the same intersectional focus on assisting marginalized people that we should have in everything we do. And budgeting is, you know, kind of the number one point here. It's laying out our priorities for the year. We should be doing that well. In states that are successful, good taxation schemes and good budgets use revenue for that essential services are provided really, really well. So how am I going to look at budgeting? The same as any candidate, I'd like to think that I'm going to try and reduce needless bloat, loose screws, issues that will tighten our budget a little bit. But I want to make sure that the focus that we put in our budget has that intersectional focus and marginalization, that we're realizing what I call the nuts and bolts issues, things like mobility, transit, accessibility, things that help lots of people really, really fast, things that can, if done correctly, can have a massive impact on our citizens. I'm hearing, many people that I'm speaking to asking what I'm going to do about taxes, asking how we're going to deal with the fact that we have this unprecedented financial situation. And as I've said tonight, I'm not a big fan of the idea of raising taxes. I don't really want to take money from anybody's pocket if I don't have to. But at the end of the day, I'm aware that some people are saying that we might be looking at this in the future. If this is the way the city is headed anyway, what we need is not a no new taxes promise, as far as I'm concerned. What we need is a promise to make sure that the taxes we take in are spent. And that means that we're delivering services right the first time, that we're making our city walkable, that we're making it accessible, that we're doing everything we can to encourage affordable housing, that we're doing everything we can to make sure that there are as few gaps in the services we provide as humanly possible, so that the residents don't have to fill those gaps in themselves. Because if you are paying into the city, as far as I'm concerned, that's so how will I be approaching it? Reprioritize, refocus, make sure that we're assisting marginalized people first, and make sure that we're spending your money really, really well.
Thank you, Ophelia. Sean, with the reality of the current economic pressures, the City of St. John's will be facing a budget crunch. How would you approach the process of budgeting in the city?
All right, thank you very much again, Brad, for the question. So I've indicated that I'm not a supporter of new taxes. I don't think we need to increase taxes in the city. Much like my colleague Ophelia just spoke to, I would expect when I sat down at the council table that I would identify what are the things that we must do in this city. There is an expectation from the citizens of St. John's and the citizens of Ward 2 as the things that we must do. And what I mean by that is, we must do snow clearing, we must do garbage and water and sewer, fire protection, there's transit, there are things you have to do. So there's a chunk of the budget that you just have to carve off and say, those things we must do, but let's look at how we're doing that to see if we're doing it in the most efficient and economical way that we can. And maybe there are other ways that we can be offering the same level of service in a different way that wouldn't cost as much or take as long or whatever it is. So you have to be open-minded in terms of what's being done and how you're going to continue to do that in the future. So it's not, here's how we've always done it, let's keep doing it. It's, let's look at what it is we have to do, but are there better ways that we can do that? Are there other jurisdictions we can look to, other techniques, infrastructure, equipment that we could buy, that we could do it differently, do it better, et cetera, et cetera. That's point one that I would make to you on the things that we have to do. Then there would be a chunk of the budget that I would look at that are, I'll use the term discretionary. Not necessarily would they all be discretionary, but there are things that you would like to do or things that you feel you should be doing. And those are the things that I think public engagement is so important on. Those are the things that I think we need to talk to the citizens of the city, talk to the residents of the ward to find out what are their priorities. We do have limited amounts of tax. I believe we have enough money in the budget to provide the level of services that we need to be providing, but it's how we go about that that's going to be important, and how we're going to use that money in the best possible way. So do the things you have to do, then talk as well about the things to see what people would like to have done and how you're going to spend that money. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Greg Smith, with the reality of the current economic pressures, the city will be facing a budget cut in the future, a budget crunch in the future. How would you approach the process of budgeting in the City of St. John's?
First, I have no plans to raise taxes at this time. I think that St. John's needs to be an affordable and competitive city to live in. And I also believe that in a pandemic where people are barely getting by, I don't think this is the time to do so. I think that people are already in a crunch as it is, just like the city. I think that we need to, optimize services, find efficiencies within them, see if there's ways that we can, find some additional spending. I think that another thing that we need to do is like I stated earlier, the Salem Mile 1 could be beneficial to the city, in my opinion. I think that that could really work in our favor. It's a tax burden on the city of St. John's. I think that, seeing that we're expected to get somewhere around, 18 to 20 million in a deficit this year, I think that though it is not the intent or the purpose of it, we might need to look into tapping into that 22.1 million in our reserve. I know that it was talked about on council and they didn't pass that, but I think this is an extraordinary year, especially with COVID-19, Snowmageddon. This is something that we might need to do. Additionally, I would ensure and I would lobby and make sure that we get the disaster relief money from Snowmageddon from the federal government, which I believe is somewhere in the $3.5–4 million range. And also, I think that when it comes to new environmental standards for the city of St. John's, I think that, as a city that is, so old and has done things for a certain way for a long time, I think that the best thing that we can do is also, on top of what I stated, ask to the federal government and say, we need some additional money to make this a green city as well. It can't just be thrown on us right away. You have to work with us and make sure that we can deliver what you want. So I think that's pretty well it, is, finding ways to really combat this and making sure that St. John's is a city that is affordable for everybody. And to me, that's not by raising taxes, especially at this time.
Thank you, Greg. Carol, with the reality of current economic pressures, the city will be facing a budget crunch in the near future. How would you approach the process of budgeting in St. John's?
Well, first of all, council has been alluding to the fact that there is a strong possibility that they will be recommending an increase in taxes for the citizens of the city. I'm opposed to that. And I think in this economic climate, it is a really, really bad time to try and impose any kind of increases, financial increases on people. We've seen people this in the past year go through a time, and we're going to see it over the next number of months as well, go to a time of financial hardship where people have lost their jobs. Others have had reduced hours of work. We see businesses struggling to survive, and they're just not in a position to be able to pay or to deal with that kind of a burden of tax hikes. So what does the city do? I think that there are several ways to address that. One is that this council has to be innovative in addressing efficiencies of operations, and to do that rather than look at that first, rather than look at imposing taxes. And so where do you start? Where do you start with that? I think a good place to start would be, number one, looking at the monies from Snowmageddon. I think there was an anticipation that the federal government was going to help the city out with that. And I don't know where that is at this point, but I'm not aware that the federal government has come to the aid of the city, and that's something that we need to address. Also, and I alluded to this earlier, we have to look at the eliminating that subsidy to Mile 1. And we also need to look at capital projects that need to be reviewed, see what we can delay that's not going to really affect people. When I'm talking about not having an increase in the taxes, I am not talking about cuts to services or programs for the people. I'm talking about a different way of doing business. And I have experience in that, in dealing with a very similar issue in a position that I had previously. where I took office and inherited a major loan, which there was supposed to be 2 levies placed on the membership. And I said at that time, I didn't agree with it, and we could deal with that without the levies. Well, it was a difficult process because people didn't think you could do it. But in the end, we changed how we did business. There are obviously, has been alluded to, there are obviously some parts of your budget that you just cannot change. You know, so you go from there, and there are ways of changing how you do business, doing things on a better way of doing things, and dealing with the and addressing efficiencies of operations. And I think that we can deal with that without layoffs to staff, without cutting programs and services, and ensuring that we still have safety as an issue in our winter snow clearing.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Greg Noseworthy. With the reality of the current economic pressures, there will be a budget crunch for the city in the coming years. How would you approach the process of budgeting in St. John's?
Again, first and foremost, it's a 1-year term. And I want to make it very clear to everybody that I'm not in it just for this election. I'm in it for this election, the next election, and the following election. The reality is we need to have a forward-thinking approach to how we're going to assess budgeting. The city does this on a 3-year term. So every 3 years, the city comes out with a new budget. And I want in 10 years to look back and say, my God, we got through it. Look at that. We were able to make a difference and not cut programs, not raise taxes, and come out on top after COVID, after Snowmageddon. How would I do that? A number of different things. Some of the candidates have touched on talking about efficiencies, and I'd actually like to point out a few where I think we can actually address those inefficiencies. Number one, the city regularly goes over its budget in snow clearing. We see it time and time again. You Google snow clearing budget, City of St. John's, you're going to see all the years that the city has gone over. If we simply put the money up front at the beginning of the budget and we say, we've gone $1.5 million over for the last 3 years, and this year we say, let's put an extra $1.5 million in, all that money can be used more proactively. It'll be money that's not spent on overtime hours. It'll create more work hours. It'll create more jobs. And this will allow for more efficient snow clearing in the city. Another one, you drive up Bennett Avenue, you drive up Watson, you drive Virginia Park, you go on Gower. Doesn't matter what part of the ward you're in. You can go anywhere in the city. Frecker Drive, doesn't matter. You're going to see patchwork. The roads are covered and littered in patchwork. And you wonder, every 2 feet, there's another block of pavement that's been cut up. Why the city doesn't simply cut out a full strip and do it properly the first job, spend the money up front, and not have to deal with it in another year or 6 months? It's a good question. If we can put the money up front forward the first time, get the job right the first time, we'll have a more prosperous 2030, 2040, 2050. We don't have to cut programs. We don't have to lay off people. We don't have to cut services such as Metrobus. We can proactively address our budget for the years to come by actually spending the money up front and saving in the long term. And again, I think this is having a long-term vision to this. We can't be short-sighted. The city's been short-sighted for too long. It's been a lot of us versus them attitudes, not working well with other municipalities, and those days are gone. Those old ideas are gone. It's time to look at a new way of actually handling budgets, and that's how I would do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Lauren, with the reality of the current economic pressures facing the city, there will be a budget crunch in the coming year. How would you approach the process of budgeting in St. John's? Lauren, you're still muted. If you want to just unmute yourself and start again.
Got it. I thought you were handling the muting thing, but after the last boo-boo there. Cheers, thank you. In the original wording of the question I received, you referenced Snowmageddon, COVID-19, and the water treatment facility that's may or may not be required. And that's where I'd like to focus the answer to my question is, Snowmageddon was costly, yes, indeed. We ran into an overrun of about $4 to $5 million approximately. COVID, there's heavy costs associated with that too. And that's a global issue, so we're not alone there. But I think I want to point out one thing that's really important that I think a lot of people, it's not on a lot of people's radar. It's not the most exciting topic, but it's the one most important issue facing the city right now, and that is the new, the Department of Fisheries have placed regulations on the city of St. John's that require an additional secondary water treatment facility. It was assessed or quoted years ago at $255 million. Now, the federal government has already, excuse me, offered to pay 50% of that, and the provincial government has offered to pay the other 25. However, in recent years, this has been in limbo for years now, and we were given a deadline of 2020 to deal with this matter. It's practically come and gone, of course. What we have to do there is look at the facility that's existing, look at efficiencies, get a different inspection done, because I'm hearing conflicting things from different members, different staff at the city. And I'd like to find out what the reality is. Do we need a secondary facility? Because if we do, that's going to be one of the most costly things this city has ever faced, of course, since it's the last one. And if we do indeed, if it is determined we do need a second facility, we've got to go back to Ottawa, who are now claiming that they are not going to pay for the 50%. They will pay of the cost coming, but they're only prepared to pay for the 50% of the quoted cost from years ago, which has gone up millions of dollars. So that's my concern for this city. That is a project, if needed, that is going to be very expensive for taxpayers, and not just property owners, people who rent. Their taxes are going to go up too. This is going to affect everybody right down the line. So, you know, everybody is going to be affected, and it's a very serious matter. I think that's the biggest issue that I see in the budget coming up.
Thank you, Lauren. And finally, Matt, with the reality, the current economic pressures, there will be a budget crunch facing the city in the near future. How would you approach the process of budgeting in St. John's?
Well, I think it all boils down to the slogan that I've been running under, and that's community first. Our budgeting decisions have to be made with the wants and needs and the goals of the people who live here in mind. I don't think we can hit pause on trying to make St. John's a better, more accessible place for us all to live. It's okay to run deficits. Modern monetary theory tells us that it's okay to run deficits. We can't use this poor economic situation as an excuse to impose austerity on the people of St. John's. We have to keep, as a municipal government, we have to do whatever we can to keep people safe, happy, and healthy. So we need to maintain the services we have. We can't be afraid to run deficits. It's perfectly okay. However, we can also increase revenue as well. Like I said before, a simple elimination of the commercial vacancy properties allowance could give us another 4 million or so in revenue annually that we can use to make sure we maintain our quality of services here. We can also start a database of Airbnb properties, and we can charge business tax to the operators, similar to what they do in Bonavista. And according to the city's own numbers, that could generate about $300,000 a year of revenue also. And we can get away from privatizing our parking and ticketing services like we have with that pay by phone parking app downtown on Harbor Drive. We're sending a portion of our ticketing revenue and our parking revenue to Volkswagen Financial Services, like they're in Europe. What are we doing that for, you know? But yeah, it all comes down to community first budgeting. And when it comes to removing the commercial vacancy allowance, I understand there are small business operators who do own their own building and could really use that allowance. But the rule should be that people pay full price, and then we could administer the exceptions on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Matt. And that ends our third question for our Happy City St. John's Ward 2 by-election town hall debate. We finally did it, friends. We all went over our 2 minutes. So just a reminder, in the interest of time, we're trying to stay under that 2-minute barrier. We've got a nice little clock there in the corner if you want to use it to watch yourself. So for question 4, Carol, you'll be first. St. John's City Council recently voted to maintain the status quo for sidewalk snow clearing, despite a public engagement report that showed overwhelming dissatisfaction with the current level of service and support for allocating additional resources, including a tax increase. And our question, how should council use public engagement in its future decision-making processes?
Sorry. Let me just speak to the first part of that question first. I think we all agree that snow clearing is a major issue. And there are parts of our city where we see snow plows going up on a regular basis, and people don't require having their sidewalks and that done because the streets are nice and wide. I had a family member last year who actually dislocated her shoulder because she fell while she was out walking, going to an errand. So I'm fully aware of the importance of having that and the health aspects to it as well. But let me just speak now to the public engagement part. I think it's critical in ascertaining the wishes of the citizens that they have public engagement. But I also think it's pointless for council to engage the public if their intention is to ignore them. And the city has to reflect on the needs of the people, and the city has to be for the people. That means if you're going to engage people in dialogue, then you need to listen to what they are saying. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. Greg Smith. I won't go through the preamble each time, but the City of St. John's recently voted to maintain the status quo for sidewalk snow clearing, despite a public engagement report that supported changes being made. So Greg, so how should council use public engagement in its future decision-making processes?
So first of all, I want to state that this is a huge issue. It is an issue for people throughout the ward and for myself personally, getting around. And I think that is a massive, massive issue. So kind of in the same way that Carol said, and to just echo, but it is exactly how I feel. And I think a lot of us are going to feel that way. Why would we ask our citizens how they feel about something, especially when it's an issue that is basically a human rights issue? It's a way that people get out of their house and they get throughout our city to get to shops, services, whatever. Why would we ask their opinion, have an overwhelming, and I mean incredibly overwhelming response stating that they don't want the status quo? We have to forego the status quo. So why would we ask these questions, get this result, and do nothing about it? I don't understand it. I just think it makes no sense. This issue is a huge issue for a lot of people, and it's not an issue that is even close. It's not even a 50-50 issue. It's also an issue for every single one of us in Ward 2, especially in certain areas. So another part of it too, though, is I think that we have to pose the question initially on how we're going to do that. So if we're going to have public engagement, we're going to ask our citizens to discuss and give feedback on on what we need to do and how to move forward. I think fundamentally we have to first outline how we are going to make that service happen, how we're going to pay for that service, and how it's all going to transpire. So I think that those are really important things. Really, really, really important, even though, we don't listen to the OCM question of the day as a way to gauge what our citizens think. In a sense, we need to use it as a city ourselves. Only 20% of people on the VOCM question of the day stated that they would be in favor of a tax increase. So I think that we really need to ask the question of how we're paying for it first, as opposed to after. So I think that's quite important. And fundamentally, if we're going to ask our citizens something, give them all the details. And this here needs to be something that is at the forefront at the beginning. This is a huge issue for everybody. and accessibility shouldn't be a privilege. It should be an absolute right.
Thank you, Greg. Lauren, City of St. John's has recently voted to maintain the status quo for sidewalk snow clearing despite a public engagement report that showed overwhelming support for additional resources being allocated. How should council use public engagement in its future decision-making processes?
Well, I want to echo some of what the other candidates said, in that it's one thing to pursue the engagement, is another thing to act on it. And of course, I think the city many people were shocked recently when the engagement results came in and the council went against what the engagement results provided. I mean, this is democracy in its truest sense. However, my issue with the engagement results in this particular on this particular subject was the fact that approximately 1,000 people responded, and I don't think that's a big enough pool to choose from. I suspect that's why council. Everybody's asking the same question: why did council make that decision? I think that's the reason, because the amount of people that did participate, it was a very small number representatively, and I suspect. I think what needs to be done is you need to get more people to engage. You get a clearer indication of what people truly want. Yes, a lot of people downtown want snow clearing and sidewalk clearing. That's a given. It's difficult to comment on why council made that decision, but I think if they're going to be engaging, they really need to look at the results and act accordingly.
Thank you, Lauren. Sean, the city has recently voted to maintain the status quo for sidewalk snow clearing despite a public engagement report that's heavily supported allocating additional resources. How should council use public engagement in its future decision-making processes?
Oh, again, thank you very much, Brad, for the question. I think we have clear examples. People are referring to the most recent one about the snow clearing, but I think we have clear examples of where the public engagement process has not worked. I commend the current council in terms of having an engagement strategy, but I would make the argument that I don't think it's working. And I would echo and support what one of the other candidates just said, that I don't think it's wide reaching enough. I don't think we're giving enough people access to engagement to be able to get a true sense of how the citizens of the city feel on an issue. And the issue that we just referred to about the snow clearing, council went against what people wanted, and there's been an outcry over that. But just recently, there was a public engagement process on Rollins Cross, and the council went with what the public wanted, but the recommendation from a safety perspective was to do something different. And there was some discussion from people that maybe by going with what the public wanted, there may be liability issues. So all of that points to me to an engagement process that isn't working. So I do believe the city needs to have an engagement process. I do believe the city needs to allow the opportunity for more people to engage in that engagement process. And we have to find ways that we're able to get people included. It has to be more inclusive, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make. And, you know, holding a meeting at City Hall at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night, one time for an hour and a half, doesn't cut it. You need to be able to spread the meeting through the city. Maybe it's being done through mediums like we're using now. Maybe it's done over a series of nights, you know, that we have nights, days, weekends, whatever the case may be. Maybe we reach out to community groups that do good community engagement, frontline agencies, and ask them to help us with this. We're not the experts on all of this stuff, and there's people out there who can help us, and we should use them. So I'll stop there, recognizing the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. I want to welcome Wallace Ryan. Wallace will get you to join in with our fourth question at the end of our other candidates. So I'll be reading the question several times so you can hear the question and then join in. So Matt, St. John's City Council recently voted to maintain the status quo for sidewalk snow clearing despite a public engagement report that showed support for allocating additional resources. How should council use public engagement in its future decision-making processes?
I think that public engagement here has to be more than just lip service and just ticking another box on the way to a predetermined decision or predetermined course of action. I think, especially when it comes to building developments and redevelopments, we have to involve the public in the planning and design phase, not just the approval phase. That way, we don't get things getting really far along and then people being blindsided by, something in their neighborhood that they don't think they'd like to live near, So I think it's important that we engage the public in along every step of the way, and that we act in good faith on their input and their recommendations. And I mean, given what happened with the Bairds Cove development, like people have been referencing earlier, where it seemed to be pretty clear that the public was not in favor of this building, not in favor of this redevelopment, and the council voted for it anyway. I think they're worried about, say, what's going to happen at Garrison Hill, where there's a similar project coming through, where people want exemptions for building in the heritage district and whatnot. And yeah, we need to reinstill some faith in the public when it comes to, or faith from the public when it comes to how we approve these things. I'd just like to mention, though, with the development at Bairds Cove, it was interesting to me that the mayor took part in the vote that approved that redevelopment when he actually took a donation in the previous election campaign from the proponent. And, in any functioning democracy anywhere in the world, someone in that position would not have been in the room for the vote. So I think we really need to look at the money in politics and where it comes from and where it goes also.
Thank you, Matt. Greg Noseworthy. The City Council recently voted to maintain the status quo for sidewalk snow clearing despite a public engagement report that showed support for allocating additional resources. How should Council use public engagement in its future decision-making processes?
I'm going to keep this short and sweet, because the reality is the city is clearly not using public engagement processes. We regularly get reports, we regularly get feedback from the residents in the city, in Ward 2, and we regularly ignore them. Mr. Skinner pointed out a great example where we had a professional report demonstrate that there were quantitatively less accidents, less serious accidents at Rollins Cross. The very next day that it was turned back the way it was, there was a head-on collision. And this is ridiculous. If the city is spending money and actually putting out things to the public to have engagement and to not listen to them, it's absolutely useless. So I think the short and sweet answer here is the city should use public engagement, not just hear it. They should listen and actually use it. We're going to see this same issue come up. We've seen it come up already at Parish Hall, where the city has gone ahead and made a development, has approved a development, and now they're backtracking because the residents have strongly and rightly so showed their displeasure and dissatisfaction with the public engagement process. We're seeing it at Atlantic Place here now again, where we have another similar situation. Atlantic Place, its history is wrought with poor decision and lack of public engagement from its original development to what it is now to what it will be in the future. We've seen similar things happen in Pleasantville, in the east end of the city, and we're going to see it again probably too up at Booth Memorial, what's left of it. The city just doesn't listen. So to keep it short and sweet, the city needs to use public engagement and not just piecemeal have it there for something to be at. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And Ophelia. The city recently voted to maintain the status quo for sidewalk snow clearing despite a public engagement report that showed overwhelming support for allocating additional resources. How should council use public engagement in its future decision-making processes?
Well, I think I've spoken pretty extensively on the sidewalk clearing portion of this this evening. Suffice to what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a big point and a little point. I'm going to echo some things that have been said here throughout. I think I've spoken to a lot of residents, and I'm one of these. I contributed to the sidewalk clearing consultation process. I'm dealing with a lot of residents who are feeling very frustrated that they feel that they put a ton of time and energy into these things and their voices are not being heard. I, as a candidate and as a researcher and as a counselor, and as I will be as a counselor, am a supporter of evidence-based policy. What I think that means is that There are going to be times in the public engagement process when the recommendation from the city and the engagement clash. What we have to do is be prepared to place great weight on what the public is saying when public desires and evidence line up. The snow clearing issue, this is not just a question of this is something the public is saying they want. We know it is quantitatively safer. We know it is qualitatively safer. We know it's a human rights issue. We should be placing tremendous weight on the fact that not only do we know that for a fact, everyone or most people, certainly the vast majority, are in agreement. And I think that in moments like that, we should place tremendous weight on public consultation. We always should be listening to, of course, and in moments of clashes and in moments of disagreements, as with the Rollins Cross project, for example, especially if we've invested a great deal of money in something, be prepared to go with what the evidence says, and be prepared to go with, not refusing to listen to the public, but maybe there are issues. Are we being transparent enough? Are we educating people enough? Are there things we can do to better communicate what we do so that people can better understand where we're coming from? Because in my experience, a lot of this stuff comes down to bad communication. I think that if we're more effective in explaining why we're trying to go the places that we're going and why we're making the choices that we're making, I think that, that because public engagement goes both ways. We have to listen to them, and we need to make sure that we're communicating effectively as well. Small issue, allow Zoom in-person consultation meetings. It'll be a massive leveler.
Thank you so much, Ophelia. And I want to welcome Wallace Ryan, who's joined us. And Wallace, our question is, I'll read the full question so you have it. St. John's City Council recently voted to maintain the status quo for sidewalk snow clearing despite a public engagement report that showed overwhelming dissatisfaction with the current level of service and support for allocating additional resources, including a tax increase. How should council use public engagement in its future decision-making processes? You're still muted, Wallace. If you want to, there you go. If you want to start your answer again, thank you.
How do I sound good now?
You're good now. Thank you.
Okay. When it comes to public engagement, the Rollins Cross is actually a good example. And it's an example for the opposite things of what one of the previous speakers were talking about, because I spearheaded that petition to restore Rollins Cross to its original historic configuration. And for many reasons. For one thing, when they talked about, and this is why you got to get more public engagement. When they talk about, for instance, oh, it's a safer place, they didn't tell you that it's safer by 1 in a million, right? They claim that with the roundabout there, that it was 1 in a million, and without the lights it was 2 in a million. So it's basically 1 in a million accident. The other thing was when they did restore it, as opposed to a lot of other places, they did put up zero signage to allow people to know that it was there. Now, when it comes to public engagement, it's a perfect example because none of the people in this neighborhood wanted that. I myself, when that first started, I went through that intersection 15 times, and I almost got hit 15 times out of the hundreds. Now I live right on the cross, so I walk through it quite a bit. And in the time that it was up there like that, I was almost run over 15 times. I seen folks older than myself having to hoof it because of some speed demon tearing through that intersection and almost hitting them. And now when it comes to engagement, their engagement was ridiculous. They, as a matter of fact, if you read the study that they did on it, there was absolutely no mention of the safety of pedestrians. And that's why the people in this neighborhood were so pissed off with it. They basically went ahead, they did what they wanted, and inflicted a terrible, terrible idea on the neighborhood here. I mean, we have a school just around the corner here. We have children walking up and down through that intersection. We have dozens of teenagers coming from Brother Rice and Holy Heart walking through that intersection. And what they were doing, they were presenting a clear and present danger to everyone there. Now, if they truly did research it, they would have realized that in the early 2000s, they removed what we call the infamous missing light on Rollins Cross. And what that is there was a light there, right there behind where I am up there on Military and Kings Road intersection. And there used to be a light that used to face up towards the Basilica and all that. And when they took it out, within 2 weeks of them taking it out, one of the neighbors here got clipped by a car coming down through the intersection. Because without that missing light, the infamous missing light there, when people approach that intersection, it looks like the light and where they're supposed to stop is on the other side of the intersection. So they plow right on through. Now, in the meantime,
I'm just going to give you a time check there, Wallace. 10 seconds to
Yep.
finish up your
Yep.
response.
except for the 2 accidents there, since then there have been no accidents. Where the headlines were there, right? Don't see that on the CBC. Don't see that on the Evening Telegram, right? So, like I say, the engagement is a thing, and I've fought them on many subjects and all that. And public engagement is a problem. You know,
Thank you I'm going to stop you there, Wallace, out of respect for time. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to our last question of our Happy City St. John's Ward 2 by-election town hall. I encourage anyone watching on Facebook Live to share. Since it's our last question, I invite all the candidates to resist the urge to respond to anything except the question that we've received from residents of the area. Our final question, and Lauren, you'll be first to speak. When on the topic of access and inclusion, a number of candidates have spoken to the necessity of speaking with those who are directly affected. What does including marginalized communities in decision-making look like to you? And what are some of your past experiences working with marginalized groups that you will draw lessons from?
Well, I recently, I was speaking to a friend of mine who does have a disability, and he pointed out a CBC presentation to me. It was done in 2017. Many people have seen it. It was widely shown. It was called Access Denied. It's just a series of small clips, really 3 to 4 minutes a piece. And I watched them all and just recently, and it was quite eye-opening. And it really reiterated to me that there are members of our community that have, there's different types, many different types of disabilities in our community, and they're not always apparent to us. Now, the city has done good work here. The current council in the city has done good work here in that we do have an inclusion committee at City Hall, and it is on that committee, different groups with different types of disabilities are represented. I know there's some of those seats are currently empty right now, unfortunately. But I think that is the path. We need to make sure those seats get filled and make sure that the seats that are filled on a continual basis are represented well by people who, excuse me, people that are bringing good ideas forward. We need to see through their eyes what they encounter on a daily basis. And I think, so the city has done great work there in that regard already, and I think that needs to be continued. In addition to that, as for my experiences working with marginalized people, over the years, many, more recently, I think of my everyday life working in the restaurant industry, we have people from all walks of life, different countries, different backgrounds. Some have language barriers. I often help some of the staff with language and stuff. I really enjoy it. I'm interested in languages. And in addition to that, often it's just simple things like offering a ride home, offering a ride to work, or in some cases, taking staff members on outings and seeing some of the local sites, because we've got people working with us who've been here for a couple of years, and they really, recently I took someone to Middle Cove, his first time down there, and he was very surprised. Just because he didn't have a car, he walked back and forth to work, and I was surprised, and I was overjoyed with how much he really enjoyed, that outing on that particular day. I'm over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Matt, when on the topic of access and inclusion, a number of candidates have spoken to the necessity of speaking with those who are directly affected. What does including marginalized communities in decision-making look like to you? And what are some of your past experiences working with marginalized groups that you will draw lessons from?
Well, First of all, I think it means trying our best to recognize and check our privilege in the things we do and the decisions we make. I mean, a lot of us will never fully comprehend how tilted the playing fields can be and how many obstacles can be strewn about. These barriers, you know, they're both structural and they're systemic, and we always need to be aware that they exist. And as we try to dismantle those, it's important that our strategy is informed by the lived experience of people who've been marginalized and oppressed. And to that end, I think it's really important, yeah, like Lauren just said, we have to rely on the expertise of the city's Inclusion Advisory Council. And like I said before too, this has to be more than box ticking. It has to be more than lip service. When you get a group of experts like this together, we have to listen to what they have to say and we have to act on it accordingly. As far as my own experience goes, I've worked as an educator for 6 years. I ran a business downtown for 6 years, and I'm currently working in youth care, which I've done off and on since university days. And, you know, whenever you work with the public like that, you're always working with marginalized people, whether it be socially or economically or whatnot. I think it's important that we do whatever we can to make accommodations and try to remove some of these barriers for participation and decision making. And I guess, yeah, throughout my time teaching and working in youth care in particular, I've had these two little mantras. One of them is everyone's journey is sacred, which I heard from a coworker one time. That's been useful. And also, I like this one too. It's a Kurt Vonnegut quote. We're all in the same rock hurtling through space. And I've taken, you know, that approach throughout my life the last few years, and I'll continue to do that as a city councilor as well.
Thank you, Matt. Greg Noseworthy. When on the topic of access and inclusion, a number of candidates have spoken to the necessity of speaking with those who are directly affected. What does including marginalized communities in decision-making look like to you? And what are some of your past experiences working with marginalized groups that you will draw lessons from?
So for me, when dealing with any marginalized group, regardless of background, lived experiences, it doesn't matter. To me, I take an equitable approach, and I'll take a second to define equity. Equity is about giving people what they need to be at an equal playing field with everybody else. It's not about equality. We're not about putting everybody at this exact level. We have to understand that certain people need more than others. That's the reality of life. That's how I always handle anybody, regardless of background. Some of my experiences have been shaped by my work and my studies throughout the world. I work with the nonprofit Public Legal Information Association, Newfoundland Labrador. My title there is an Access to Justice Coordinator. From here, I've worked with the provincial and national networks for preventing elder abuse. I sit on the board for the national one, actually. I've worked with Empower. I'm on the St. John's Pride Board. I've done so many different things with groups who face these types of struggles, and it's really opened my eyes over the years that we need to take an equitable approach to addressing the concerns of everybody so that everybody is at an equal playing field and nobody's getting left behind. That's how I approach these things. My past experiences have really taught me to look out for everybody, to understand that I can't experience everything that everybody else is experiencing, what they're going through. I won't pretend to, but I'll certainly listen and do my best to make sure that everybody has a voice. With that in mind, I recognize that there are a number of different groups, communities, and persons who live in the city, not just Ward 2, whether it's from Mundy Pond, downtown, the East End, Pleasantville, you name it, anywhere in the city. I recognize that there are people throughout this growing city from different backgrounds that we need to be aware of. We have a growing French population as well. Pour les francophones ici, je vous vois. There's so much going on here tonight. It's incredible. And I think we have a really great opportunity as a city moving forward to actually take proactive steps to address the concerns of everybody and make sure that those who are often marginalized aren't left behind. So for me, it's about taking an equitable approach so that everybody is included. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Ophelia, when on the topic of access and inclusion, a number of candidates have spoken to the necessity of speaking with those who are directly affected. What does including marginalized communities in decision-making look like to you? And what are some of your past experiences working with marginalized groups that you will draw lessons from?
Thanks, Brad. I think personal experience matters here. I bring a wealth of lived experience to the table that's rare to find in politics in this province and to an extent in the country. I'm the first openly non-binary person to run for office in Newfoundland and Labrador. I am the second transgender person to run for city council here in St. John's. I have extensive work experience through my activism and my academic, predominantly in gender equity fields and particularly concentrated with sex workers. I have extensive experience working with SHOP, the Status of Women Council and the Women's Center, various event planning committees. I've been a strong advocate for sex workers. I have extensive connections and extensive experience working with that community as well as many others. So I have a lot of lived experience and a lot of history to deploy here. I'll say two things about this in terms of how we can include people better. I take an equitable approach as well. And I think that properly and equity at the municipal level means actively foregrounding marginalized voices to actively correct injustice. That means placing really great weight on the words of people like the Inclusion Advisory Committee. It means ensuring that we're redressing the imbalances of justice that we find in our society and the work that we do, because by doing that, that's how we're going to create an equitable world. I'll leave you tonight, I'll sign off tonight on my end with this. Marginalized people belong everywhere in the political process. People say we deserve a seat at the table. We deserve a seat at the table. We deserve to design the table. We deserve a seat at every table at every step of the way, and that includes on council, and that includes administration everywhere. That includes on council. When we have leaders who reflect diverse lived experiences, that's going to make our government speak from diverse points of view, listen to diverse points of view better, and ultimately work greater toward equity. When we have that happening, that will create a better world for marginalized people, and that will create a better world for all of us. We're in this together. Let's stand together. Let's make sure that council is representative, the council is as beautifully diverse as our city is, and that we're working towards equity and justice in everything we do.
Thank you, Ophelia. Carol, when on the topic of access and inclusion, a number of candidates have spoken to the necessity of speaking with those who are directly affected. What does including marginalized communities in decision-making look like to you? And what are some of your past experiences working with marginalized groups that you will draw lessons from?
Thank you. The reason I think that marginalized communities need to be consulted is because they have unique experiences, and they have to be included in a say into how issues are addressed. So the reason I want to speak with others who may have different issues is that I might think there's a problem or a solution to a problem. Somebody else might have something very different to say on that. And we need to hear from those who are involved with their own unique perspectives on an issue. And for example, you know, if we talk about safety, safety for somebody who is non-sighted might have a different connotation than it does for somebody who has an issue at home in his or her own house or their own house. So, or somebody who's walking down the street and is being accosted because of who they are. So it may have, you know, issues might have different connotations to them. But most importantly, I want to hear from marginalized groups, and I want to hear, I want to know about their attempts or how we might deal and resolve the problems and work with them to do that. And I want to ensure that that council is being inclusive in that. So I've worked through my many years working. I've lobbied for groups in various settings: home care, seniors, persons with disabilities, injured workers, human rights, women's rights. I taught special ed for a while, and all of those people, all of these groups have unique experiences that we may not be aware of with respect to issues that we're trying to address. So I think you need to know the circumstances of where they're coming from. So for me, what does it including marginalized communities in decision making look like? It looks like people having a say. It looks like council considering a partnership when making decisions, and it looks like people being a part of a solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. Wallace, when on the topic of access and inclusion, a number of candidates have spoken to the necessity of speaking with those who are directly affected. What does including marginalized communities in decision-making look like to you? And what are some of your past experiences working with marginalized groups that you will draw lessons from? If you want to unmute yourself there again, that would be great.
It's just not cooperating with me this evening. And thank you for your patience, by the way. Being a working stiff, I made it as quick as I could to air. So thank you very much for your patience. Access and inclusion are vital rights for everyone. Access and inclusion should be the privilege of all spirits. Access and inclusion should be our default setting. It shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be institutionalized. It should be a part of who we are as a people. When you talk about experiences, I'll never forget an experience I had. When I lived in New York City, I worked with the Coalition for the Homeless, handing out food to people all throughout. And I saw people truly in need who were pushed really to the edge of society. And I'll never forget in the Bronx, give out food, there'd be a bit of soup, bit of bread, some buns and all that. And I'll never forget this little African-American child, 6 years old. And she was standing there with a bagel almost the size of her, just chewing on it. No shoes on, no people with her, no parents, no nothing. And I thought to myself, this shouldn't be, this should not stand. And it's things like that, it makes us think that the way we treat marginalized people in our society is a reflection on us, and we have to open the tent to everyone. And that's about all I can say. And once again, thank you. By the way, I will answer a lot of your questions on my Facebook page there if anyone wants to check in after the debate or whatever. So I know I've missed a lot of your questions, and I really appreciate you still having me on.
Thank you, Wallace. We appreciate you joining us. Greg Smith, when on the topic of access and inclusion, a number of candidates have spoken to the necessity of speaking with those who are directly affected. What does including marginalized communities in decision-making look like to you? And what are some of your past experiences working with marginalized groups that you will draw lessons from?
Hi, first of all, welcome, Wallace. Glad to have you on. It is a priority for me to make St. John's a city for everybody. I think that, accessibility needs to be a forethought and not an afterthought. I believe that St. John's needs to be a place where everybody is welcome, and equity is the go-to mindset to make sure that everybody is closer on an equal playing field than ever before. We need to move in the right direction. We're all equal in my mind, and we need that our policies, we need access to be equal as well. We need the playing field to be even. I think, as a city to move forward, we can't leave anybody behind. I think that speaks loads on us as a society. And another part of this too is I think that, we had the Water Street Pedestrian Mall, which was a great success. But it was an afterthought to make it accessible. We need to make sure that is at the premier of all of our thoughts, is to make this city, make businesses either that are there or new, make them accessible. Everybody deserves access to services. I think, with the Inclusion and Diversity Committee on Council, we need to, use what they say at the utmost. I think that is incredibly important. We need to also engage with established groups in our city within these marginalized areas, especially on topics that concern them solely and on all topics, because, it really matters. Myself personally, You know, as an LGBTQ plus person, I understand, you know, the challenges facing marginalized groups. I promise to be a strong voice for everybody, and I'll be proactive on issues. And I'll make sure that I'm a representative that includes everybody and make sure that it's an equitable city, from the downtown core to Cashin Avenue, all the way to Logie Bay Road and everywhere in between. I will make sure that everybody's voices are heard. We make sure that accessibility, inclusion, diversity, and making sure that we take care of one another is at the forefront of all discussions and all policy.
Thank you, Greg. And Sean, when on the topic of access and inclusion, a number of candidates have spoken to the necessity of speaking with those who are directly affected. What does including marginalized communities in decision-making look like to you? And what are some of your past experiences working with marginalized groups that you will draw lessons from?
My response to that question would involve making sure that we need to entrench or make a part of our normal process the ability for people to be able to access us, for marginalized groups to be able to access us, so that we hear their voices and we understand and hear their points of view. It's important that we make the attempt to reach out. It's not a passive thing where we sit there and wait for this, but we need to be active in terms of reaching out. So the city has an inclusion committee. I would consider that to be a part of the reaching out. But we also need to be accessing their frontline community agencies that do some great work that would very quickly be able to help the city understand some of the points of view of the marginalized groups in terms of accessibility and inclusion. It would, you know, from my perspective, I guess, I would say to you, I come from my own certain perspective. I grew up downtown. I grew up in a, you know, middle class type of a family. You know, walked the streets, took the city buses, et cetera, et cetera. My experience is not necessarily the experience of everybody else. So my community work, I've tried to involve myself with other groups and agencies to get a broader perspective of who is living in our community and how we can help those people. So I volunteered with the Boys and Girls Club. I volunteered with End Homelessness St. John's. I volunteered with the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. I volunteer with a whole bunch of groups, as I'm sure all the other candidates have. I'm not trying to say that I'm the only one here doing that. I'm sure all of us have. But I've done it because I wanted to ensure that in roles that I had where I was in a leadership position in either a group or the community, that I was able to be as open and embracing as I could be, and trying to make sure that as we advanced ourselves as a society, as a city, that everybody else who lived around me and lived in the same community as me had those same opportunities. So from my perspective, access and inclusion is about recognizing not everybody is like you. You need to hear from other people. You need to consider them and their views when you're making decisions that impact everybody. And thanks everybody for the opportunity tonight, and good luck to all the candidates.
Thank you, Sean. That's it for our 5 questions. I want to start by thanking all our candidates for joining us this evening, to Carol Furlong, Matt House, Lauren Loader, Greg Noseworthy, Ophelia Ravencroft, Wallace Ryan, Sean Skinner, and Greg Smith. We appreciate your gift of time tonight. Happy City would like to thank all those who joined and participated in our Facebook Live and our chat. We appreciate all the feedback we've received, both positive and suggestions for future events. We will take it all and make sure that when we do this in the future, we take all of that into account. Please remember the importance of each individual vote in Ward 2, and we encourage everyone to get out and exercise your right and responsibility to vote on Tuesday, October 20th. Take care and good night.
See you, everybody.
Thanks so much, guys. Take care and good luck.
Cheers.